Welcome to Modern Education, the show that dives into all things relevant to learning. Modern Education has a guest each week for an in-depth conversation about some aspects of teaching and learning. Join the host of Modern Education, Benjamin S. Woodford, as we continue to evolve the important topics for effective learning today. We will unpack the ways community members, students, teachers, parents, and researchers approach learning in all its forms. And now, introducing the host of Modern Education, Benjamin S. Woodford.
Hello, welcome back to Modern Education. I'm your host, Benjamin Woodford. I'm in the studio with my guest today, David Shuang Song, and we're going to have a great conversation. This is 90.1 KZSU Stanford. If you're just joining us, this is the Modern Education radio show, and we are happy to have you with us. If you have questions or comments, you can call or text them in at 855-723-9010. We're always happy to hear from you. The texts are great because you can send in your questions and I will get to them on the air if I get the chance, and I really appreciate hearing from you. So I'm going to bring the guest on here and we're going to say hello and get started. David, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's nice to be here, Ben.
So, David, you are, I think I forgot your intro. So, David he holds a bachelor's degree in English literature and economics from Washington University in St. Louis, a master's in public policy from Maryland University, and David's currently studying the sociology of education here at Stanford. So, welcome yet again.
Thank you.
Can you start out by just helping the audience get a little bit of a feel for who you are as a person? Specifically, I'm thinking if you can illustrate how you became interested in studying education and sociology and how you married those two things in your own journey?
Yeah, sure. So, in my previous life before working as a graduate research assistant and the PhD student here at Stanford, I was working in education policy and public policy back in the University of Maryland at Baltimore County. And I was working on a Gates Foundation-sponsored initiative around STEM, community colleges, and higher education. And it was at that moment in which I became really interested in, first, education policy as something that, exists at the intersection of a lot of fields of study about class, race, teaching and learning, and culture, for lack of a better word. And when I began my first year of research at Stanford a couple of years ago, I became increasingly interested in the ways that things like ethnicity, race, and class become instantiated, reproduced, and imagined and inscribed in school settings.
Okay, so you're looking at where race comes from and how it is sort of embedded within the culture of schools. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things that always surprised me as I was kind of initiated into the field of education studies is not so much the marginalization of the issue of racial inequality in education, but rather the ways in which it's asserted, reasserted, conceptualized, and reconceptualized over and over again. So quite often we are quite volubly talking about ethnicity, race, and the concept of the achievement gaps. But one of the things that holds a lot of my interest right now in my dissertation work is not just what are these particular gaps of achievement, of literacy, math, science, what have you, between blacks and whites, Asians and non-Asians, immigrants and non-immigrants, but rather how schooling accomplishes or has the potential to accomplish the act of racialization and the act of ethnic and linguistic differentiation.
So you're talking about how, it sounds like what you're talking about is school actually serving as a function to establish these paradigms and these ways of seeing our differences?
Right, very much. Because I think one of the ways, and perhaps a more conventional way that we think about education, is that it's allocating different resources to different groups within society. But I also think that one of the things that, it is worth looking at, and here I'm thinking specifically of, some ethnographic works that have informed my background as well as the field of linguistic anthropology and the sociology of language, are the ways in which students come to inhabit and get a feel for, as it were, class positions as well as positions of ethnicity and race.
Okay, interesting. So how are some of those, what are some of those functions or the ways people come into those roles in their lives in school?
Well, I think one of the questions that, is always worth asking within school, and, one of my colleagues, I think, who recently graduated from the Stanford Graduate School of Education was asking this question in her own ethnography, is who gets to be a knower in school, who gets to be endowed with identities and subjectivities of being able to produce knowledge, of being able to coherently communicate and reassemble knowledge, of being able to, for lack of a better word, be a good student and be someone who's good at school. And we can't really think about those things without attending to racial and ethnic hierarchies as well as class hierarchies within school. We have to think about school as, in many ways, as an apparatus that is preparing or trying to prepare students for certain stratified positions in class society.
Yeah. So you mentioned something about like who is considered a good student.
Yeah.
What does that look like? What do you think? What is your opinion of what is considered maybe the archetypal good student or perfect student or desirable student in a classroom? What are the qualities?
Knowing how to participate in the rituals of school and not being too blatant about how the rituals of school are, in so many ways, BS. They're rotes and they're rights and they're things that have to be maintained to give school the kind of appearance of institutional credibility, when in fact, in so many ways, our education system does consist of students doing exercises that are, perfunctorily checked, or they're learning ways of communication, ways of writing, ways of doing problems that are basically, ways to show that they know things, but within the context of a standardized test.
Okay. So I'm really interested because you use this word rituals, right? And that is generally something that is reserved for a religious rite or some sort of rite of passage. Does school actually serve a similar type of function to those things?
I mean, sociology and language studies, linguistics are deeply concerned with rituals. Perhaps not quite in the religious sense or the magical sense, but concerned with rituals in the sense of what has to go on in the, block of hours from Monday to Friday of school in order to preserve the appearance and the trappings that one, real education is going on within a school, and also the transformation of appearance into reality, in the sense that good students are students who come to internalize these kinds of habits of obedience and ritual, and this in some ways prepares them to enter fields of adult work. And
right.
That's the kind of that's one of the theses that exists in the more I suppose left-leaning areas of sociology of education, that school, contrary to our liberal expectations, isn't some kind of great equalizer. It isn't a way to use cognitive ability or intelligence as a leveling of the playing field. It actually is a way for middle and upper middle class students to assert particular hierarchies and privileges of work, and ways for institutions to route working class and racially and ethnically marginalized students into adult subordinate positions.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you talking about sounds like there's this narrative that says something along the lines of, if you do well, you will excel or
Absolutely.
Get better or something like that.
Absolutely.
And maybe the reality is more that this serves as a way to legitimize class structure and sort of say, well, you didn't do well in school, and school was made for people to show that they do well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. This and this is, by some accounts of education, the for lack of a better word, the actual purpose of schools, to legitimize class and racial hierarchies and to give them the appearance of individual effort.
Right. And it gives us a way to sort of depersonalize the prospect of saying you are already coming from a good family, therefore you will do well.
Exactly.
And you are coming from maybe a working class family, so you will stay there.
Exactly. And that's, Jean Anyon and Pierre Bourdieu's work, sociologists and radical social scientists, who talked about the ways in which working class students quite often, when they're asked by the researchers such as Jean Anyon, can you produce knowledge? Who has knowledge? The working class students, and I should say too, racially subordinated students, often give quite different answers than students who are of middle class or of the upper class.
Yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot on specifics, but does anything come to mind specifically about what the different perceptions are between those groups? If you were to ask them, where does knowledge come from, or who creates it? Do you have something on the tip of your tongue?
Yeah, I think so Anyon's work back, I believe, in the 1980s, 1981, she was a bit more of a, I don't want to say she was proposing the simple structure, but I think she was proposing class as a highly determinate structure, so that working class kids, when they're asked these kinds of questions, they say, well, the teacher has knowledge, the textbook has knowledge. Middle class students, upper class students, I should say, can quite confidently assert, we have knowledge, we're able to produce knowledge, we're able to manipulate, disseminate, and communicate knowledge. And I think for middle class students, for me, it's always been the most interesting answer, because they inhabit those particular tensions, and they're open to a degree of agency isn't quite the right word, but they're open to a degree of socioeconomic mobility affected through knowledge. Mm-hmm. And Anyon's argument about that wasn't that this was, necessarily a positive or a liberating position. It cultivated narcissism and insecurity. It cultivated a deep sense of anxiety that you didn't know everything there was to know, or that you weren't doing the rituals as well as the next kid. And I think that very much reflects a lot of the socioeconomic anxieties and precarities that are experienced by lots of youth from middle class groups, and as well as I'm thinking about youth from some racially minoritized groups, as well as children from first and second generation immigrant groups.
Yeah. That
education in some ways is, on the one hand, it's dangled up as a lifeline to, a kind of better life when you're an adult, or a better life than their parents have. But in that sense, the thing that gets dangled as a lifeline, it cultivates a lot of deep insecurities. It's a real precarity that you always have to be hustling for advancement or even just security.
Right. And it's a funny thing, because it actually has been a lifeline for many people. I
Absolutely.
think myself and many of at least a few of the guests come to mind that I've had on the show have outwardly said, education has helped me get to where I am today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we know, from a statistical standpoint, that is the exception and not the rule. Mm-hmm. And yet we hold these pictures of success through education and through achievement or hard work up as the kind of gold standard of this is what it should look like. This is how you do it. And yet it sounds like what you're saying, and maybe the overarching lesson here is that is not the case for most people.
Yeah, and I think nowhere is this really better embodied, at least in my own experience of scholarship, than in particular immigrant and ethnic and racial minority groups in the United States. Now, I'm working on my dissertation, which will be a kind of ethnographic study of language and ethnic and racial boundary setting through language in public high schools, and I'll be working, fingers crossed, potentially with 2 high schools that have a rather high Asian American population. One school in the South Bay that is majority Asian, and another school that is maybe 25 to 30% Asian and maybe 2/3 Latinx. And I think so often of a recent work of sociology on Asian America that came out a couple of years ago. It's called The Asian American Achievement Paradox by Jennifer Lee and Min Zhou. They're 2 sociologists of Asian America, one at Irvine, one at UCLA. And one of the things that they talk about is they kind of try to address this, somewhat anxious and awkward question that, I think is part of the racial imaginary in America, but it's not always addressed, which is why are the Asian kids always so smart and well behaved and achieving and blah blah blah. And obviously I don't want to give truth to that particular stereotype, but they themselves, Lee and Zhou, talk about this in a couple of ways. And the first way they talk about it is that they address that this particular phenomena of Asian achievement is real if you look at particular measurements of college entrance, standardized achievement, standardized test, academic achievement. But they located it in specific ways that emphasize the selectivity of American immigration policy that selects for, at least with East Asian Americans from China, Korea, Japan, that tends to select for professionally educated or entrepreneurial families to enter the U.S. and in turn keeping out numerous other populations, working class populations, poor populations, education populations without educational credentials. So in a way, we are, in a sense, importing populations of skilled workers into the United States, and then upon their entry, we go through these. We ethnicize and we racialize them, and we do racialize and ethnicize ourselves as Asian Americans or Chinese Americans or Korean Americans, and the way that I think is a really interesting sociological puzzle for that still remains to be asked is so a new kind of ethnic, racial, and also class population is being formed through immigration and racialization in the United States. Wow. And then we might ask ourselves, what does that look like? What does that look like when kids who, because of their class advantages, because of their parents' educations, because of habitus and social networks at a local level, what does it look like when these kinds of kids are so often academically high achievers, and yet also ethnically, linguistically, or racially othered and not experienced as a face of America? Yeah. And I think in that book, The Asian American Achievement Paradox, as well as other books on Asian America, they address this problem quite thoroughly, and then they have different kinds of conclusions about where Asian America is headed. But I think one of the things that really goes less noticed, at least by pundits and commentators, is that rates of self-efficacy, rates of anxiety, rates of worry, and even mental illness among these kinds of quote-unquote successful or potentially successful Asian American youth are high. They're very disproportionately high. And one of the first papers by Min Zhou from UCLA back in the 90s, I think, talked about the ways in which this kind of psychic toll and this kind of mental stress was actually positively correlated with academic achievement, whereas for other youth, it was quite often negatively correlated with academic achievement.
So let's break that down for a second. Yeah. So you're saying that these students, the Asian American or immigrant students or sons and daughters come here, and then they have a very high stress level and anxiety level, but that seems to be the more stress they have, the more achievement they're getting as well, which is sort of different than what maybe other racial groups or class groups are exhibiting. Yeah, so to make that more specific, just because we're on the radio and I'm waving my hands around here, So if you have higher anxiety, that would generally be associated with lower achievement because you're having a hard time and you're feeling like you don't belong.
Yeah.
And then those same types of feelings seem to be correlated the other direction in this one group of people, the Asian immigrant families and descendants.
Yeah. So I think a lot of times, the really uncritical wing of social science and education studies, it asks, what are the Asians doing right? And it's such a loaded question because it doesn't look at the histories of immigration selectivity, but it also doesn't it also presumes that the Asians, quote unquote, are doing something right and that they're not paying a particular toll and not going through these kinds of academic experiences without a very particular experience of racialization and precarity.
Yeah, and I wanted to go back to this idea about like immigration selection.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned this idea, and it sounds kind of like what you're making a case for is that we have sort of chosen what we value within the immigrants that are coming here, and then we have decided to let in only people that are, on paper at least, fit the value systems that we've assigned to them to want to come here.
Yeah, and I think this is deeply embedded both in our political economy and also in our rhetoric of what is, an appropriate or what is a legible immigrant. I mean, I think it's there everywhere from, I remember Lin-Manuel Miranda, once had that song about immigrants getting the job done, and more recently with Trump, lots of liberal discourses trying to assert that America is a nation of immigrants, America thrive, immigrants make America great, and to me, that kind of rhetoric and those kinds of discourses has always been laden with an ideology that immigrants, in particular immigrants from the global south, from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, that they have to earn their place in America in a way that is not presumed and is not projected toward white Americans.
Right. So it's this idea you can come here as long as you show us that you're worth our time, so to speak, instead of you are here, therefore you are one of us.
I think in many ways it's, it's a parallel to the model minority. There are appropriate ways of subjecting yourself, of performing yourself as a minority, as an immigrant. But those kinds of norms only exist they exist at least in part to stigmatize other kinds of bad minorities and quote unquote bad kinds of minorities, quote unquote bad kinds of immigrants.
Right. So it's saying we appreciate immigrants as long as you act this way, as long as you do these types of jobs, as long as you fit the mold of what we've decided, or maybe painted a picture culturally of where you fit into society.
Exactly. So these ideas about, quiet Asians or collectivist Asians or Asians that, don't seem to be doing much in the way of individual subjectivity, individual performance, individual communication. I mean, these are, at least in part, products of these kinds of settler colonial ideologies that configure populations, both black, indigenous, and immigrant populations in these kinds of ways.
Right. Yeah. So, wow. It's a weird thing too, because how do you stop something like that?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, quite.
It's so deeply ingrained in the societal expectation and even many generations old, to where we forget where the stereotype ends and the reality begins.
And I think it's quite difficult, perhaps to an extent within Asian American or ethnic minority immigrant communities themselves, in the sense that, at least in my experience and in my field work, it's always seemed to me that the second generation of immigrants is always, or is frequently, much more attuned to the kinds of racism, racial discrimination, racialization, and these kinds of deferrals of inclusion than the first generation. And that's very much a part of the sociology of migration literature, that the first generation has a reference point, has a linguistic, cultural, social touchstone.
Right.
The second generation is hustling around trying to figure out what it is.
Yeah, I can completely identify that for myself. And I'm a first generation mainlander, I guess I would say. My mom's Puerto Rican, and she still has the language from her homeland.
Yeah.
And my dad is an immigrant as well, and he spoke English and still does. So, but for me, I was born here. Yeah. I am an American as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that's right.
And I can pass off as white well enough that people don't question it. But even from myself, I can feel the disconnect between knowing that I am from here and this is all I've ever known, and yet also knowing that I'm disconnected from my roots. And I don't have the language to even make that connection in the way that other people might. And so,
exactly.
I think it's definitely one of those things where how do you identify as something other than American when America is all you've ever known?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And this, I think, gets into the area of my dissertation that I think is potentially quite rich, in the sense that what happens when this specific group of immigrant youth is learning language, and specifically the language that is their heritage language. And here, in the field of linguistics, heritage language has long had a double meaning.
Explain that.
The first meaning is one of presumption. The first meaning says, well, you have a heritage language, and that's the one that your parents spoke. It's the one that your culture, quote unquote, speaks. So you don't have to have learned that language or spoken that language or used that language, but because of who your mom and dad or your wider community happen to be,
right,
Chinese or Lakota or Spanish or whatever, is your heritage language,
right? And
that rests, that's always rested on, in my opinion, on forms of cultural and racial essentialism and homogenization, as if
let's unpack that a little bit.
There are numerous languages. There's numerous languages and dialects, in as far as languages are, homogenous, bounded, entitized things. There are numerous languages in China.
Right.
But which language is so often treated as the heritage language of Chinese youth? It's Mandarin Chinese.
Right.
When in fact, a huge amount of people speak, Chinese Americans in the U.S. speak Cantonese, and to a lesser extent, Hakka, Taishanese, and other languages. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that this definition, the one of presumption, this definition of heritage language risks resting on presumptions about which culture is really yours, and it often defers the agentic cultural work of immigrant minority youth.
Yeah, and I'm hearing an element in this of privileging a certain stereotypical heritage language and saying if you come from the most widely recognized one, then somehow that is better or more in line with our expectations for you.
Exactly. And I'll get back to this in a bit, but the other definition of heritage language is, in my mind, a much more sound and sensible one, and it's the one that you grew up knowing. It's the one that you grew up knowing in your home, in your church, in your community. But it's also one in which it was never the dominant language. And that definition of language really, maps to the linguistic experience of so many immigrant youth.
Right. And it makes a lot more sense, too, right? To just say, oh, you're from China, so Mandarin must be or Cantonese, right, must be the language that is meaningful to you. It doesn't make sense, especially if you've never spoken it or your parents didn't come from a region where that was dominant. It's just, it's sort of putting a label on to someone that doesn't even belong there.
Exactly. And then this definition it's so much trickier because there are so many different forms of language competence that you can then have. Sometimes you can have very low written or competence in writing or reading, but you can be very good at oral production or reception.
Right.
And it all depends on context. It all depends on background.
Right. So we're talking here, if you're just joining us, I'm here with David Shuang Song, who is a graduate student here at Stanford, and we're talking about immigration and language, and we were just discussing the idea of being a nation of immigrants, which I believe stems back, as far as my knowledge, from a quote from, or a series of quotes from John F. Kennedy, one of which is another way of indicating the importance of immigration to America is to point out that every American who ever lived, with exception of one group, presumably that would be the Native Americans, was either an immigrant himself or a descendant of immigrants. So this is the side, sort of, I think, the root of this sentiment, right?
Yeah.
And your claim, let's just sort of summarize the claim again. How is this hurting us, or how is this sort of an improper use of language here?
Well, the idea that, we are a nation of immigrants, it in my mind, it completely disguises the settler colonial nature of the United States. Certainly indigenous and First Nations people are not immigrants, but I think it's rather strange, at the very least, to claim that African Americans, that enslaved populations, somehow count as immigrants.
Right.
But we should even question the idea of whether whites or the racial majority count as immigrants, or would have counted themselves as immigrants historically speaking either. Ann Coulter, who I know is easy to harp and punch on, or to criticize, recently said something like, "I'm not an immigrant. My parents weren't immigrants; they were settlers." And we can debate whether or not that particular, whether she in particular is a immigrant or a settler, or whether her ancestors were immigrants or settlers. We can debate that, but I think it's much more accurate to call the social formation of the United States since its beginning as one of settlerism and not immigration.
Right.
That settlers saw this particular land as something to conquer, to exploit, to render into private property, and then to organize and demarcate through social technology such as race, racial exclusion, and the racialization of all sorts of populations.
Right. And this idea of being an immigrant almost implies acclimating to where you end up, right? Becoming part of the country where you end up.
Exactly.
And Americans, the Americans we think of now, came here and we appropriated the land. We appropriated the ways of living as to be our own, we took the things we wanted from the people who already lived here and then sort of rejected everything else about their lifestyle.
Absolutely. And I think, we can debate the particularities of this, but one of the things that always caught my attention is that the early history of incorporating Asian Americans into the United States, in the 19th century. You can call that immigration. I'm not going to debate the semantics, but that was a form of recruiting impoverished populations of workers with very little alternatives to labor. And one of the things that I understand to be the case, I could be mistaken, anthropologist Stacy Lee at the University of Wisconsin knows more about this, is that after the Civil War, when slavery, ended, white settlers in the South, landowners in the South asked themselves, who now is our cheap, disposable population of workers?
Right.
If not African Americans, if not blacks. And the answer that some of them came up with it's the Chinese. And that's why there is still a sizable, a small but sizable chunk of Chinese immigrants in the Mississippi Delta who have lived there since about the 1860s, 1870s. They're fully, quote unquote, assimilated linguistically, religiously, and of course racially as legible Asian Americans into the American South. But to kind of talk about them as immigrants in the same sense that, for example, Irish, Italian, and other European populations were incorporated into the U.S. During the early 20th century. It's quite different, I think.
Right.
It's quite different.
Right, yeah. And I think there's something really important there to think about, just in the instance of how we think about and talk about people changes our perception or our our understanding of who they are and how they came to be here. And even just the point you made about the African Americans coming here was not by their own will. They did not immigrate here. They were forced here but under whips and chains. And that is a different dynamic entirely, right? When you think of an immigrant coming here, you think of somebody, or at least I do, sort of in my little thought bubble, there's a person who is trying to leave where they were to maybe get a new start or to have a new set of opportunities. And that is not the case at all for certain groups, right? And this seems to be, it's easy to sort of overlook the language in the sense of the understanding of, oh yes, well they came here from somewhere else, so they're immigrants, but it doesn't honor the reality of the roles people played and all that.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think America in general, we've been a colonial society for a long time, similar to England in that respect, and yet we sort of downplay this, right? We use language and we use rhetoric to sort of keep the underlying American value of what we're really doing economically, which I would say is the main driver behind a lot of these dynamics, and we try to paint it with a different picture, right? This is the land of opportunity. Come here and you'll have a fresh shot. And then the reality is, this is the land of opportunity if you already have a lot of means in the first place, and if you satisfy the criteria for our expectation of you, so that we will even let you in.
Yeah, and I think this is what is so potentially dangerous in the last 2 years about trying to marshal criticisms and even organized rhetoric against the Trump administration. And I think what's unfortunate about that rhetoric is that it refuses to recognize the ways in which nativism and border control and the expulsion or the management of immigrant populations is nothing new. The institutions that we're thankfully strongly criticizing in this moment, they were created in the W. Bush and the Obama administrations, and they were handed to Trump to use as the current administration sees fit. So in a lot of ways, when our counter discourse, when our counter rhetoric against Trumpism, as it were, against nativism, as it were, is statements like America is a nation of immigrants, it really is treacherous about the ways in which populations are really migrating and moving to the U.S. and becoming, I'm not going to say assimilated, but going through changes that can be perceived or not perceived as kinds of assimilation. Yeah. And assimilation is certainly a different topic that is worth thinking about in education as well. What counts as assimilation, and to whom is something like academic achievement or linguistic or Anglicization becoming apparently monolingual English. Right. To whom are these things considered assimilation, and to whom are these things considered sort of necessary adaptations post-migration?
Right. Now, do you think we should still be celebrating people coming here and wanting to come here? Is that something that should have a place to talk about in a positive light? I mean, we can criticize the language, and we can criticize the sort of implications of how we other people through that language. Yeah. But at the same time, there is a richness to the diversity of bringing people in from new places. Yeah. And there's a richness to having a variety of languages and backgrounds and foods and cultures within any country. I think so. Yeah. So what can you think of maybe expand with me a little bit here? How can we have a positive light on that doesn't automatically other people in the process?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly not against celebrate cultural additions, festivals, foods, clothing, these kinds of things. I think for me, what's really important is to be able to locate what impels particular populations to migrate. And I think if we had a closer understanding of that, for example, we would be able to see that many people who are trying to enter the U.S. now are fleeing because of violence that has been instigated directly or indirectly by the U.S. military. Or,
right.
If we look at the particular ways in which well-educated immigrants, often from African and East Asian countries, are coming to the U.S., we might ask ourselves, wait, we're letting in a certain professional or entrepreneurial or educated class of people.
Yeah.
But who else would be migrating? Who else from the global south or from other parts of the world would be migrating to the United States if there were open borders? And if we imagined a different populations migrating to the U.S., how might we react if so many of the other different immigrant populations weren't so formally educated, weren't professionals, weren't entrepreneurs?
Right.
And it's actually a little bit disturbing for me to kind of imagine the hostility that Americans might actually greet a different population of immigrants coming to the U.S.
Yeah, and it's a tough situation too, because if you see the world as a zero-sum game where anyone getting something has to take it from someone else, then that is, if you have that worldview, it's a very legitimate threat, right? There are people coming, and if there's more people here and we already don't have enough jobs, then those people are taking our jobs in some way. I'm using air quotes here.
Right.
And so it creates a challenge of understanding a worldview, creates a perception that is almost impossible to escape until you start questioning your worldview.
Yeah, and the kind of nativism, is unfortunately very reinforced by the kinds of essentialist cultural and racial identity politics that many people, both on the leftish and the rightish sides of the political spectrums, are engaging with. So we have someone like, a fascist like Richard Spencer insisting that he's a white identitarian, that he wants, white America to have a kind of, safe space or kind of a cultural relocation in America. And obviously that's a lot of bunk, and it's something that a lot of us can easily dismiss. But if we presume that the populations that are migrating have these kinds of coherent, bounded, entitized identities and cultures and practices that are not open to hybridization or development or change or adaptation, then potentially people might be worried about what kind of mosaic or what kind of melting pot or what kind of fruit salad America is going to be.
Right.
But I think ultimately those kinds of worries are, basically, I think those kinds of worries are basically ways of expressing anxieties that different people are in the U.S. and perceiving economic precarity, which is a characteristic of our society, among both whites and non-minorities, of perceiving and expressing economic precarity and marginalization as being threatened by immigrant populations.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that is very unfortunate in our handling or in the ideologies that we're producing and receiving in America.
Right. And it is very much something that is received. These are stories and ways of thinking that are passed down, right? We live in this, this supposedly capitalist society, which in a capitalist sort of worldview, there are profits and losses, and there are winners and losers. And this is built into almost the DNA of how America sees itself.
And this is what is so dangerous about forms of articulating resistance against capitalism that don't have the kinds of analysis of race, immigration, ethnicity, migration that we're talking about. That a lot of times a kind of pseudo-resistance to capitalism arises, and that's something like, well, the white workers or like the real Americans, there should be a safety net for us.
Right.
Right. Capitalism, it's going a bit too far. It's becoming too inhuman. Let's scale it back and let's make sure that there's, a social safety net for a particular population. And that's a politics that, has historically been mobilized with effectiveness, but it's something that certainly leaves out many other populations, and quite often that defers or corrodes the very real possibility of worker organizing or socialist organizing.
Right. And I'm reminded of Bernie Sanders' campaign, and he outwardly called himself a democratic socialist, which I think in some ways was a maybe political suicide, even though it was a perfectly normal and rational thing to say. We have a stigma in our society, in this particular society, I should say the American society, about communism and socialism, which I think are still kind of carryovers from our previous war involvements and the propaganda around sort of demonizing the communist ideals and the socialist ideals.
Yeah, and I think what is very frustrating to me about someone who does believe in those kinds of ideals is the ways in which, we seem to have a particular amnesia in the States about how socialism and communism has been taken up often by minority populations, by blacks, by Latinxes, by immigrants, as a way of asserting and organizing workers. And now it's become strangely very easy for us to say, we've never been socialist, we've never been communist, when in fact, those ideologies and those practices are threads running throughout the history of the 20th century in America, and are very deeply interlinked with things like the civil rights movement.
Right.
And the anti-war movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is no such thing as a pure communist or a pure capitalist society. That does not exist. And when we hold up a certain Russia, for instance, or something like that, and we say, "Oh, this is the cautionary tale why we shouldn't do that." And the reality is, those examples we bring up aren't pure representations of communism either. Just like our society is not a pure representation of capitalism. There are already these. There's no just one single place you can point to and say this does it completely and purely, and look, it works or doesn't.
Yeah, sure.
Because that's just not possible. And so it's better to think maybe it could, I don't know if this is the answer or not, but it could be better to think, okay, instead of thinking so black and white terms, think of the gradient in between the two. And where do we want to fall on certain issues, right? Not we are capitalist or we are communist, but maybe with wages, for instance, the bottom rung of wages should have some communist or socialist, I think is probably the more appropriate term, elements where you have a living wage, for instance. It doesn't mean people can't get more ahead, doesn't mean you can't excel beyond your sort of birth rate base pay, but that there is a gradient of where these ideas should be more acceptable or not.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, anyway, I want to switch gears a little bit. We just got a couple minutes left, and I don't know if we can do this justice.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
So we're talking about the immigrants and the stories that sort of come with those the immigrants as they come here, and sort of bringing a bit of their culture here. And I think an element to this is storytelling. Right? We have stories that we tell people to sort of keep them down. We have stories we tell our children to connect them to where they've come from. And I think in this day and age, stories, although they're a central part of the human experience for before the written word, stories have sort of become monopolized through television and sadly maybe radio. Radio's, I think, one of the last vestiges. We can say radio's still good, but television, movies, news media, they sort of narrate what our story is for us. And where I'm going with this is Dungeons and Dragons. So this is a game that you've been deeply interested in for many years, and I think has a very rich storytelling element to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that maybe there's an element in there that can be useful for us to get that need met for stories. And I want to just give you a few minutes to talk about where does Dungeons and Dragons fit into this for you and the storytelling elements? Where does that come up?
Yeah, to me, it comes down to an issue of cultural production, and we can go back to this class issue of like who produces culture and who makes culture, and we can have a very pessimistic Frankfurt School idea that says culture is coming from on high. It's being produced by Hollywood. It's being produced by the ruling class, and it's being used to hypnotize and sedate the masses. Blah blah blah. But I think, and I'm not denying that we have very powerful discourses and rhetoric that racialize and do symbolic violence against people. But I think the more interesting question to me has always been, what are the forms of cultural production on the ground that people, and particularly youth and marginalized youth, girls, LGBTQ youth, are engaged in all the time? And for me, one of the reasons that Dungeons & Dragons is so interesting as a apparatus for storytelling is that it basically blurs the distinctions between consumer and producer. I've been told by my literature professor that back in the day, people like Shelley, like Yeats, 19th century poets and authors, they believed that Shakespeare wasn't meant to be performed in the theater. It was meant to be read aloud by your friends in like the sitting lounge or the drawing room or whatever, and to be enjoyed in a way that, places both actor and receiver in a kind of circle and instantiates the kinds of cultural production in the moment at a local level, and doesn't subordinate the needs of cultural production to a market or to an outside audience. Wow. And that's what's always been super interesting and also frustrating about Dungeons & Dragons to me. It's that, within every Dungeons & Dragons game, there's almost like an infinite or an infinitely heterogeneous set of possibilities that has to be unlocked. And the irony is that, you can only do any game once. Right. But that's the kind of pleasure that's taken in at least some Dungeons & Dragons games, that, all sorts of things could have happened from character creation to, the final resolution of the plot. Right. But it's also frustrating in the sense that on a larger scale, Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing games have always been beholden to the outside market, to the fantasy, art, and literature genre. And one of the things that's super unfortunate is that Dungeons & Dragons has always been very deeply enmeshed in both colonial and patriarchal logics, the ways that monsters are represented. I was tweeting or Facebooking with some friends this morning about it, and I said Dungeons & Dragons has basically inherited lots of Greek and European representations about the female and the non-masculine monstrous. Right. Harpies, lamias, which are like monsters with like the bodies of snakes and the heads of women or something. Hags, medusas, these kinds of things. And they're sort of uncritically reproduced in ways that, at the very least, have this whiff of very patriarchal and often racial and racist norms about them. And so that's something that Dungeons & Dragons has struggled a lot with and grappled a lot with. But I should say, the first time that I played a Dungeons & Dragons game from start to finish with a friend who coincidentally was also quite like me, very introverted, quiet Asian American guy. We met in college, we found some friends, and we did Dungeons & Dragons. And, the story that, we kind of unlocked and collectively produced was one about coloniality. Wow. The premise was we're on an island and we're natives and we're being colonized. And the story starts from there. That's really interesting to me because I think it highlights how the stories we tell are deeply connected to the stories we live and the stories we hear. Yeah, so absolutely. Even in this creative space where you essentially have an unlimited universe where you can create and invent the stories that get told, many times they end up mirroring the reality. And that reminds me, again, of Joseph Campbell's work and how he went all around the world and found that there were these similar threads between all the stories that maybe speak to the sort of underlying human condition that we are living and existing in. And these things can be wielded for good or ill. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Dungeons & Dragons, one of the most common critiques marshaled against it, and I think it's a completely valid critique, is that it kind of glorifies violence against, these monstrous humanoids that we've othered and that are represented as savages, and it kind of glorifies a kind of like macho Conan the Barbarian violence. And that entirely makes sense when you consider historically the kinds of young, heterosexual, often white men to whom these games were marketed, especially before the advent of before Dungeons and Dragons was really put online around 2000 in the late 1990s, I believe.
Okay, so we're just about out of time here. I have one last question that actually came in from one of the listeners.
Oh, nice.
And this question is from Alex. He wants to know, what is the role of education researchers in challenging capitalist power, or maybe in general more established power?
That's a very good question, and I think off the top of my head, I can probably think of two things. And the first is to just challenge this premise that what schools are supposed to do is sort kids from dumbest to brightest and place the brightest in management positions and place the dumbest in positions of economic precarity and subordination. I think one of the things that we should be aggressively, or at least trying to pursue in education, is opening up particular kinds of class analysis, opening up particular kinds of histories of class and political economy open to critique. So how can schools teach both histories and social formations about worker organizing, about the struggles between the struggles that layer class, race, indigeneity, gender, migration, and how is class always a part of these kinds of conversations? I think that's one thing, and I think another thing is maybe more for both counselors and teachers, and that's to be able to talk honestly with students about what are the kinds of class trajectories that we anticipate for you post-graduation, and what if you don't want to be going to college, what if you don't want to be, or rather, what if you don't want to be pursuing a kind of professional middle-class career, because we know that in this kind of society, it is a game of competition, and for quote-unquote...
Actually, I got to cut you off right there.
You.
David, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was great having this chat with you, and I love the ideas that you're bringing up. I think this is some deep stuff that could definitely warrant many, many hours of discussion, and sadly, we don't have many hours, so thanks again for coming on.
Yeah.
And this is Ben Woodford with Modern Education. Thank you for joining us, and we will be right back shortly with some station business.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode. To revisit the content from today's show or hear previous episodes, you can find us on YouTube and Facebook by searching for Modern Education. Make sure to come back next week as we continue the conversation and visit new topics connected to learning in all its modern form. The show is written, produced, and hosted by Benjamin S. Woodford. I'm the announcer, Darlene Franklin, and this has been a production of 90.1 KZSU Stanford. See you next week for more Modern Education.